In the last chapter, we saw that Andromalius returned to his cave after enjoying the meal. In this cave, he met another demon named Ate who was disguised as a raven. Just like Andromalius, this demon was also disguised as a human, and was a family member of the Morg family. Vicar was ruining the demon's plans by making Hugo lose his coldness, something that was essential for the demons. Andromalius got tired and decided to eradicate the problem from its root. Hugo and Vicar met at the main house, and while they were walking, he noticed many openings in Hugo. But instead of carrying out the revenge he had been waiting for over the last 17 years, he decided to leave it for another time. Hugo Le Baskerville bowed before Vicar and apologized from the bottom of his heart, thanking him for bringing him to Pomerian. As a reward for this, he gave Vicar the option to ask for whatever he wanted. Vicar came to the conclusion that cold-blooded Hugo no longer existed. He decided to seek revenge later and for now chose to claim his reward. While Andromalius was fixing Pomerian's hair, a maid noticed his unusual behavior. Upon realizing this, the demon Andromalius revealed his true nature, and didn't take long to get rid of her. He also noticed that Hugo liked Pomerian a lot, so he started wondering how much Hugo Le Baskerville would suffer from the loss of his beloved granddaughter. While Pomerian was distracted playing, Andromalius began to look at her with a demonic gaze, and while his body was emitting a demonic aura, he started wondering how much Hugo would be destroyed by the death of his granddaughter. He began to bring his demonic hands closer to Pomerian's head, and little by little the skin on his hands started cracking, revealing the sharp teeth of the demon that was controlling Set's body. He thought that no one would notice this since the only person who came to take care of Pomerian in the garden was the maid who was already dead. But to his bad luck, a man wearing boots appeared and caught his attention. Upon hearing the man's voice, Andromalius' happy and demonic expression changed drastically to concern, as he thought he had been discovered. The man who had caught his attention was none other than Osiris. He approached him and while staring at him intently, asked where the maid was and what he was doing here. Osiris simply stared at him intently, although deep down he knew that something had happened to him. Upon realizing that the voice belonged to Osiris, Andromalius couldn't help but feel anger as he had been so close to killing Pomerian. With a pleasant smile, Pomerian turned towards Osiris and greeted him. Andromalius also turned towards him, closed his eyes, and with a smile explained to him that the maid was not in the garden when he arrived. And since he saw Pomerian alone, he decided to stay and take care of her. Deep down, he didn't know if Osiris would believe this lie, but to his surprise, he believed it. While staring into his eyes, Osiris explained that Hugo would be very angry if he found out about this. So to avoid problems, he advised keeping it a secret from Hugo. Andromalius looked into his eyes and with a smile replied that it was a good idea. Osiris also advised him to return to his isolation training now. Upon hearing this, he closed his eyes and with a pleasant smile replied that he would start the training again next week. Deep down, he decided to kill Osiris someday as he was quite annoying. Osiris began staring into his eyes and remained silent for several minutes. Then he approached him and took hold of his arm. He looked into his eyes with a worrying look and explained that he was concerned that he was pushing himself too hard. He also added that if he needed help, then he could come and find him at any time. Andromalius looked at Osiris' hand touching his arm and was left speechless, as he couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. Someone like him who only cared about himself was worried about someone else. He clenched his teeth in anger and began to wonder if he really cared about him. He couldn't help but get angry when he thought that because of him, he was always being pressured by Hugo, since he was always comparing them to each other, and as Osiris was considered a genius. Every time Hugo compared them, he felt quite sad and began to wonder why he hadn't been born a genius like his brother. He thought that if Osiris had not existed, then Hugo would never have compared them. Osiris noticed that he was starting to get angry, so he got his attention and asked if he was okay. Upon realizing this, Andromalius put his hand on his face, and while his eyes were shining, he thought that this was not good since the remaining memories of Set were coming to his mind. He asked Osiris to forgive him, then turned around and while looking at the ground, explained that now that his brother had come here to take care of Pomerian, he would be leaving as he had important things to do. While he was walking away from them, Pomerian looked at him and remained with his mouth open. On the other hand, Osiris simply stayed watching and didn't say a word. While Andromalius was walking away from them, Osiris started thinking and several seconds later coughed to get his attention. Seeing this, Pomerian looked into Osiris' eyes and was somewhat surprised. Instead of stopping to listen to what he had to say, Andromalius simply kept walking. Upon seeing this, Osiris was quite surprised and with a sincere look, He explained to Pomerian that this was the first time he had ever cared about someone. As the son of the vice patriarch, it was a fact that Osiris had to be like him. That's how he had been taught. He had grown up watching his father's cold and heartless back. But on the day he saw his father start crying at the thought of being called grandfather someday, his thoughts changed drastically, and he realized that if Hugo, the coldest person, could express his emotions, then so could he. Although deep down he didn't know if he would be able to continue living expressing these uncomfortable emotions that existed within him. He put his hand on Pomerian's head and thanked her, addressing her as his niece, and upon seeing this, she was speechless as she didn't know what was happening. While both were enjoying the views of the garden, he began to stroke her head and thanked her from the bottom of his heart because everything was changing thanks to her coming to Baskerville. Several days later, as night fell, Andromalius returned once again to his cave, where a chilling wind began to emerge from within. Inside, Andromalius sat in his stone chair. He began to tap the floor with the heel of his shoe because he was very nervous and didn't know how to face the situation. He crouched slightly, and while biting his thumb, he stared fixedly at the ground. As he continued nervously tapping the floor with the heel of his shoe, he thought to himself that this was very annoying. Back at the Grand Palace, Hugo returned to his office with Barrymore, and while he was watching Pomerian eat a hamburger, he couldn't help but feel happy. Andromalius noticed that after that day, Hugo hadn't left Pomerian's side, and because he was in love with his granddaughter, he couldn't kill Pomerian. As he looked down at the ground, his eyes filled with anger as he thought that had been his chance. He thought that if the damn Osiris hadn't interfered, he would have been able to kill Pomerian, and thus bring back the cold Hugo. Every time this thought came back to Andromalius' mind, it made him even angrier. Little by little, he began to lose his composure, and while touching his chin, he forcefully hit his back against the stone armchair. While looking at the floor with a lost gaze, he thought to himself that there was still plenty of time before the door opened, so there was no need to hurry. Quickly, he came to the conclusion that it could be more effective to kill Pomerian when she was more valuable to Hugo. And when that moment arrived, he began to question how he would end Pomerian's life. He started wondering if he should poison her just like he had done with Roxana and make it look like she died from an illness, or if he should use the barbarians just like he had done with Penelope. When thinking about all the ways in which he had made Hugo suffer, he couldn't help but feel joy again. With a smile and a demonic look, Andromalius decided to kill Pomerian in an even crueler way so that Hugo would suffer even more from the loss. While he was immersed in his thoughts and planning how to kill Pomerian, Victor followed his tracks and arrived at the entrance of his cave. At first, he paused to think, and several seconds later, he unsheathed the Beelzebub sword and decided it was time to enter and ruin the demon's party who had taken over Set's body. Without hesitation for even a second, while his eyes were filled with rage, he gathered momentum and forcefully struck the trap created by Andromalius that was guarding the cave using the Beelzebub sword. Within seconds, the trap began to crack, and Andromalius didn't take long to realize this. The expression of happiness on his face changed drastically. Quickly, he grabbed the sword and stood up from the stone chair, while staring fixedly at the entrance of the cave. He realized that someone had made a crack in the trap. Several seconds later, he felt the presence of someone entering through the entrance and began to question who had been able to crack the trap created by the most powerful demons. From the dark entrance of the cave, slowly Victor's figure began to become visible. Several seconds later, he entered inside and with a murderous look started staring intensely at Andromalius, creating tension in the atmosphere. While staring into his eyes, he put one hand in his pocket and extended the other hand towards the demon known as Set. He explained to him that, as promised, he had come here to pay him a little visit. Upon seeing this, Andromalius became confused and started feeling afraid when he realized that the person who had managed to crack the trap was none other than Victor van Baskerville. He asked Victor how he knew he was here. Victor extended his hand and explained that he had simply followed him all the way here. He also added that since Set hadn't noticed his presence at all because he was lost in his thoughts, it had been very easy for him to follow him to the cave. Victor began activating the ability of the second slot called Silent Heal Mashusu of rank A+, causing blood to slowly spread across his hand. Upon seeing this, Andromalius became nervous and started wondering how a simple mid-level graduate had been able to create a crack in his trap. He thought to himself that if Victor had followed him into the cave, it meant he knew his true identity. While lost in his thoughts, Victor caught his attention, and while looking at the remains of skeletons of children who had been devoured by Andromalius, told him that his sudden visit had caused him many problems. He asked him what he had been doing in such a chaotic place. Upon hearing this, Andromalius also looked towards the remains of skeletons and thought that Vikir had not yet discovered his true identity. But to his bad luck, Vikir told him that it was as if Set were the demon behind the case of the missing children in the city of Underdog. Upon hearing this, Andromalius was speechless, and several seconds later, he began to smile and thought that now that he knew his true identity, he couldn't let him leave alive. He decided not to continue hiding his identity, so he showed him his true nature, and while his body was emitting a demonic aura, he smiled and with a killer look asked him how he knew all this. Then he grabbed the tie, and while he was pulling it off his neck, he asked him how he had discovered his identity. Vikir's body began to emit a murderous aura, and while staring into his eyes, he smiled and addressed Set as a demon, telling him that it seemed like he was no longer planning to hide. Andromalius took the sword in one hand and while unsheathing it, started approaching Vikir. With a demonic look in his eyes, he explained that it was no longer necessary for him to continue hiding his identity since there was no one else in the cave except the two of them. He took the sword with both hands and while unsheathing it, he mocked Vikir, telling him that he didn't know where he had gotten that confidence of his to come here alone and empty-handed. In the blink of an eye, he pounced on him and began enveloping his demonic mana in the sword. As he approached Vikir, he stared into his eyes with a murderous look and asked him with a smile if he was ready to lose his life. Andromalius aimed at Vikir's neck and in the blink of an eye, swung the sword with incredible speed and precision, attacking his neck. He couldn't help but smile as he stared into Vikir's eyes. He thought that now that Vikir was dead, no one would interfere in the demon's plans. But to his surprise, Vikir moved at inhuman speed and caught his attention, asking him why he was laughing. Upon hearing this, Andromalius looked to the side and saw a hand holding his sword, which was stuck in the ground. Seeing this, he became confused. Looking at his arm, he realized that he had cut off his hand. Vikir simply activated the Beelzebub sword and enjoyed the moment without saying a word. While Andromalius covered the wound on his hand with his other hand, he looked down at the ground and began to wonder when Vikir had pulled out a weapon. It didn't take long for him to realize that the pain he now felt was as if his soul had been severed. He came to the conclusion that the weapon Vikir had was Beelzebub, the Sword of Gluttony. He asked him how he had the relic of Grand King of Flies, the holy constellation of the ancient devil. While Vikir was enjoying watching Andromalius writhing in pain, his eyes began to shine, and as the Beelzebub sword emitted a demonic aura, he told Set that as expected, demons were knowledgeable when it came to themselves. Then he corrected himself and addressed Set as one of the 10 demons who had come to the human world in order to open the door to the demon world. Upon hearing this, Andromalius was shocked, and while covering the wound on his hand, he looked into Vikir's eyes and asked how he knew this information. At that moment, he carefully examined his body and quickly realized what was happening. He panicked and asked why the soul he possessed was different from the rest of the Baskervilles. While Vikir's body was emanating a demonic aura, Andromalius asked him why his young soul smelled like the blood of the demons. He stared into his eyes and asked if he had been to hell. Vikir simply watched as Andromalius writhed in pain and thought that he was the one who had framed him in his previous life. As if deceiving him by making him believe he was his savior hadn't been enough, he had also been the person who executed him in the end. He approached Set as a demon and asked him to wake up. When he looked into his eyes, Andromalius felt immense pressure. Vikir began to emit a demonic aura and with an evil smile, he told him to remove all thoughts from his head, as he was not going to let him die so comfortably. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.